The night he disappeared. The red carpet shimmered under 1,000 lights, stretching like a glowing ribbon across the entrance of the theater. Cameras flashed in rhythmic bursts, reporters leaned forward with rehearsed smiles, and fans pressed against the barricades, holding posters and phones high, desperate for even a fleeting glance. It was one of those nights Hollywood loved to celebrate, polished, loud, and overflowing with applause. Yet beneath the glamour, something unspoken lingered in the air, something fragile and uncertain, waiting to unfold. Sandra Bullock stood just beyond the velvet rope, her smile calm and composed, but her eyes quietly searching. She had walked countless red carpets in her life, yet tonight felt different. The premiere was important, yes, but that wasn't the reason her chest felt tight. She kept glancing toward the far end of the carpet, where she expected a familiar figure to appear, tall, reserved, dressed simply, almost out of place among the extravagance. Keanu Reeves was supposed to arrive with her. They had planned it weeks ago, laughing about how little either of them enjoyed the spectacle. Minutes passed, then more. Publicists whispered into headsets, assistants checked their phones, and a subtle tension crept in. Sandra excused herself politely from a conversation and stepped aside, scanning the crowd again. Keanu was never late, not like this. He valued punctuality not out of habit, but out of respect. When he said he'd be somewhere, he meant it. She sent a message, no reply. At first, she told herself not to worry. Keanu had always been private, sometimes unreachable when he needed quiet. But as the announcer called his name and the cameras hesitated, confusion spread. The red carpet continued to roll forward, yet a noticeable absence had taken shape. People whispered, some speculating casually, others dismissing it as a scheduling mix-up. Sandra smiled through the questions, answering with grace, but inside, unease grew heavier with each passing second. By the time the premiere began, the truth was unavoidable. Keanu Reeves had vanished. The theater lights dimmed, applause filled the room, and Sandra took her seat. She clapped when appropriate, laughed when the audience laughed, but her mind wasn't on the screen. It was somewhere else entirely, replaying the last conversation she'd had with him. Just hours earlier, he'd sounded tired but calm. He had joked softly, told her he'd see her soon, and then said something that lingered now in her thoughts. "Some nights," he'd said, "you don't realize how heavy you're carrying things until you finally stop walking." At the time, she hadn't pressed him. They both understood silence. They both knew pain didn't always announce itself loudly. After the premiere, Sandra declined the after-party. She offered polite excuses and warm smiles, but her steps were already carrying her elsewhere. She walked out into the cool night air, her phone glowing in her hand. Still nothing. No calls, no messages. Concern replaced uncertainty. She contacted his assistant, then his close friends. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him since earlier that day. The world, meanwhile, had already begun to speculate. Social media buzzed with questions, theories, and careless assumptions, all built on the shallow belief that fame explained everything. But Sandra knew better. She knew the man behind the quiet smile, the one who listened more than he spoke, who carried his grief without spectacle. She remembered the long conversations late at night, the pauses filled with understanding rather than words, the kindness he offered strangers without cameras around. This wasn't someone chasing attention. This was someone who sometimes disappeared inward, carrying burdens most people never saw. Still, something felt wrong. Early the next morning, Sandra found herself driving through nearly empty streets, guided not by certainty but by intuition. She replayed fragments of memory, hospitals visited long ago for friends, the way Keanu always spoke gently about nurses and doctors, the respect in his voice when he mentioned people who worked quietly behind the scenes of life's hardest moments. She didn't know why, but her hands turned the steering wheel toward a part of the city she rarely visited. The hospital rose ahead of her, gray and unremarkable, untouched by glamour. There were no flashing cameras here, no red carpets, no applause. Only automatic doors sliding open and shut, carrying people in and out of moments that mattered more than premieres ever could. Sandra parked and sat for a moment, gathering herself. She felt exposed without the armor of performance, stripped down to something real and vulnerable. She took a breath and stepped inside. The lobby was quiet, the air heavy with antiseptic and whispered conversations. She approached the reception desk, her voice steady but soft as she asked a simple question, careful not to draw attention, careful not to demand. The receptionist glanced at the computer, then up at Sandra's face. Recognition flickered, but professionalism held. She nodded gently and gestured toward a hallway. "He's in recovery," she said quietly. "He didn't want visitors, but you might be an exception." The walk down the corridor felt longer than any red carpet Sandra had ever walked. Each step echoed, not with applause, but with memories. She thought about how easily people forgot that even those who seemed strong could break, that even those who inspired millions could need help in silence. Outside the room she paused. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was dim, lit by soft monitors and the pale morning light filtering through blinds. Keanu lay on the bed, his face tired, lines of exhaustion etched deeper than she'd ever seen. He looked smaller somehow, not diminished, but human, profoundly human. Sandra stepped closer, her presence quiet, respectful. He stirred, his eyes opening slowly. For a moment, confusion crossed his face, then recognition, and finally something else, relief. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, his voice hoarse but gentle. She smiled, the kind of smile that carried no performance, no audience. "Neither should you," she replied softly, "but here we are." He looked away, embarrassed, vulnerable in a way the world rarely allowed him to be. He hadn't vanished for attention. He hadn't vanished by choice alone. His body had simply reached its limit, carrying years of loss, responsibility, and unspoken pain until it finally asked him to stop. "I didn't want anyone to worry," he said quietly. "I thought I could handle it, I always do." Sandra pulled a chair closer and sat beside him. "Even the strongest people need rest," she said. "Even the kindest hearts deserve care." The machines hummed gently around them as silence settled, not awkward, not heavy, but honest. In that quiet hospital room, far from flashing cameras and polished speeches, something shifted. This wasn't about disappearance or mystery anymore. It was about what happened when someone finally allowed themselves to be seen, not as a symbol, but as a person. Outside, the world continued to speculate, unaware that the real story was unfolding here. A story not about fame, but about fragility, friendship, and the courage it takes to stop pretending you're fine. And this was only the beginning. The silence he never spoke about. Morning light crept slowly through the narrow hospital window, soft and pale, touching the walls without urgency, as if even time itself had decided to move gently in this place. Sandra remained seated beside Keanu's bed, her coat draped over the back of the chair, untouched since she arrived. She had not looked at her phone once. The outside world, with its questions and noise, felt distant and irrelevant compared to the quiet truth unfolding here. Keanu lay awake now, staring at the ceiling, his expression calm but weighted, like someone standing at the edge of a memory they had avoided for far too long. Hospitals had a way of stripping life down to its essentials. There were no titles here, no applause, no expectations beyond breathing, healing, and enduring. Sandra noticed how Keanu's shoulders rose and fell more slowly than usual, how his hands rested motionless at his sides, as if even movement required negotiation. She had seen him perform strength effortlessly on screen, but this was different. This was strength without performance, vulnerability without witnesses, and it stirred something deep within her. He finally turned his head toward her, his eyes searching her face as though trying to decide how much truth he was ready to release. "I didn't plan to disappear," he said quietly, his voice still rough but steady enough to carry weight. "It just happened. One moment I was standing in my apartment, tying my shoes, thinking about the carpet, the noise, the lights, and the next, my chest felt heavy, like something inside me had finally demanded to be acknowledged." Sandra listened without interruption, understanding instinctively that this was not a moment to reassure or fix, but to witness. Keanu had always been someone who carried his experiences inward, processing pain privately, believing that enduring silently was somehow kinder to the world. Yet silence, she knew, could become a burden of its own when carried too long. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, as though afraid they might collapse under their own weight. He talked about exhaustion that sleep could not fix, about the strange loneliness that could exist even when surrounded by people, about the pressure of being seen as calm and resilient when inside, questions went unanswered. He described nights where memories returned uninvited, moments from years past that refused to soften with time, and mornings when simply getting out of bed felt like walking uphill through unseen resistance. Sandra felt her chest tighten as she listened, not because the words surprised her, but because they confirmed what she had sensed for years yet never fully articulated. Keanu was generous with others, endlessly patient, quietly kind, but rarely extended that same grace toward himself. He believed that pain was something to be managed privately, not shared, not leaned into, certainly not spoken aloud. The doctor said it wasn't just physical, Keanu continued, his gaze drifting toward the window. My body stopped because my mind never did. I kept moving forward, telling myself rest would come later, but later kept getting pushed further away. There was no self-pity in his tone, only reflection, as though he were finally observing his own life from a distance and recognizing patterns he had long ignored. Sandra leaned forward slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She thought about how often society praised endurance without ever asking what it cost. How strength was celebrated, but vulnerability quietly discouraged. She thought about how many people watched men like Keanu and assumed that calm meant unbreakable, that kindness meant immunity from pain. You don't owe anyone constant strength, she said gently. Not your fans, not your work, not even the idea people have of you. Her words were firm but kind, grounded in understanding rather than judgment. Being human isn't a failure. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, absorbing her words, perhaps letting them settle in places long guarded. When he opened them again, something had shifted. Not healed, not resolved, but acknowledged. And sometimes, acknowledgement was the first form of healing. Outside the room, nurses passed quietly, their footsteps soft, their voices respectful. None of them treated Keanu as anything other than a patient in need of care, and that strangely brought him comfort. There was no expectation to perform gratitude, no need to explain himself. He was allowed to simply exist here, imperfect and recovering. As the hours passed, Sandra stayed. They talked about small things at first, books they loved, moments on set that made them laugh, memories that carried warmth instead of weight. Gradually, those conversations deepened, weaving into reflections about purpose, about how easily life could become a series of obligations rather than choices. Keanu admitted that somewhere along the way, he had confused resilience with isolation, believing that asking for help diminished the very values he stood for. It's strange, he said at one point, a faint smile touching his lips. I've spent years believing in kindness, in empathy, in showing up for others. But when it came to myself, I thought enduring alone was the right thing to do. Sandra met his gaze steadily. Maybe this is the moment where that changes, she replied. Not just for you, but for anyone who sees you and thinks they have to suffer quietly too. That thought lingered between them, heavier than any unspoken fear. Because whether Keanu wanted it or not, people watched him. They learned from what he embodied. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was power not only in standing strong, but in allowing the world to see what strength truly looked like when stripped of illusion. Later that day, a doctor entered, explaining the road ahead with calm professionalism. Rest, monitoring, time away from pressure. The words sounded simple, but Sandra could see how challenging they felt to Keanu, who had spent so long measuring his worth by movement and productivity. Yet he nodded, accepting the plan with a quiet seriousness, understanding now that healing was not something to rush through or minimize. When visiting hours ended, Sandra stood slowly, reluctant but respectful. She placed a hand gently on the side of the bed, grounding, reassuring. You didn't vanish, she said softly. You paused, there's a difference. Keanu looked up at her, gratitude evident in his eyes, not loud or dramatic, but sincere. Thank you for finding me, he said, even when I didn't know I needed to be found. As she left the room, Sandra felt the weight of the story growing beyond the walls of the hospital. She knew the world would demand explanations, headlines would speculate, and narratives would be formed without context or compassion. But she also knew that the truth didn't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes, the most important transformations happened far from cameras, in quiet rooms where honesty finally had space to breathe. And as Keanu rested, allowing his body and mind the care they had long been denied, something subtle but profound began to take shape, a new understanding of strength, not as endurance without rest, but as the courage to stop, to speak, and to heal. The journey ahead would not be simple, recovery never was, but for the first time in a long while, Keanu was no longer walking it alone. When the world came knocking, the world did not wait for healing. It rarely ever did. While Keanu rested beneath the steady rhythm of monitored breaths and carefully measured silence, the outside world began to stir with restless curiosity. Questions multiplied faster than answers, and absence became an invitation for speculation. Online conversations surged, headlines hinted without knowing, and opinions formed with the confidence of those who had never sat in a quiet hospital room watching someone fight a battle no one could see. Sandra watched it all unfold from a distance, aware of how quickly stories hardened into assumptions when truth remained private. By the third day, the hospital felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile boundary between two realities. Inside, time moved slowly, governed by medication schedules, gentle check-ins, and the gradual return of strength. Outside, time raced ahead, fueled by urgency, expectation, and the public's hunger for certainty. Keanu sensed it too, even without looking at his phone. The weight of being missing did not disappear just because he was found. In some ways, it grew heavier, pressing against him with every hour of silence he chose to maintain. Sandra arrived early that morning, carrying not just coffee and a change of clothes, but the quiet responsibility of being a bridge between Keanu and the world he was not yet ready to face. She sat beside him, noticing how his posture had changed since the first night. He looked steadier now, less drained, but there was a new tension in his eyes, a conflict forming beneath the calm. Healing had given him clarity, and clarity had brought questions he could no longer ignore. "They're asking, aren't they?" he said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful rather than anxious. He didn't need to specify who. The world had a way of making itself known even in silence. Sandra nodded gently, choosing honesty over comfort. "They are," she replied, "not all of them with kindness, but many with concern." Keanu exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window where sunlight painted thin lines across the wall. "I don't know how to explain this without it turning into something it's not," he admitted. "I don't want this to become a headline that distracts from what matters. I don't want people thinking they need to see my pain to believe in strength." Sandra understood the fear beneath his words. Fame simplified people into symbols, and symbols rarely had room for complexity. Yet she also knew that hiding entirely would cost him something too. Silence, once a shield, had begun to feel like a weight again. "There's a difference between explaining and performing," she said carefully. "You don't owe anyone details, but you might owe yourself honesty." The idea lingered. For years, Keanu had navigated public life by giving just enough to remain accessible without surrendering his inner world. It had protected him, but it had also isolated him in subtle ways. Now, standing at the edge of recovery, he realized that returning to that old balance might no longer be enough. Something inside him had shifted, and pretending otherwise felt dishonest. Later that day, a close friend visited briefly, bringing warmth and familiarity without pressure. They talked quietly, sharing laughter that felt grounding, reminding Keanu that he was not alone in this transition. As the friend left, Keanu noticed how different this felt from before. There was no rush to appear unaffected, no need to reassure anyone with humor or deflection. He allowed himself to simply be present, and that in itself felt like progress. That evening, Sandra stepped into the hallway to take a call. When she returned, her expression was composed but serious. "They're preparing statements," she said softly. "Your team wants to know how you'd like to proceed. You can say nothing. You can say something small, or you can take time and decide later." Keanu listened, absorbing the options, each carrying its own consequences. Saying nothing would preserve privacy but invite speculation. Speaking briefly could set boundaries but risk misinterpretation. Waiting would protect his healing but prolong uncertainty. None of the choices were easy, and that realization alone made him feel unexpectedly human. He asked for time, not days, not weeks, just a moment to sit with himself without urgency. Sandra respected that, sitting quietly as he reflected, understanding that this decision was not about public image but about personal truth. As night settled in, Keanu asked for his phone, not to scroll, not to read opinions, but to write. He opened a blank note and stared at it for a long time, letting words come slowly, carefully. He wrote not as an actor, not as a figure others projected onto, but as a person acknowledging limits. He didn't describe pain in detail. He didn't dramatize his experience. He simply spoke about the importance of rest, about listening to oneself, about the courage it took to pause in a world that constantly demanded motion. Sandra watched him from across the room, recognizing the quiet bravery in what he was doing. This wasn't a statement for attention. It was an act of alignment, a way of stepping forward without pretending nothing had happened. When he finished, he didn't post it, not yet. He saved it and set the phone aside, understanding that timing mattered. Healing could not be rushed to satisfy curiosity, and he was learning to honor that truth. That night, as the hospital lights dimmed and the corridors grew quieter, Keanu lay awake, not from anxiety but from awareness. He thought about how many people felt the same pressure he had felt, the unspoken belief that stopping meant failing. He wondered how many of them were watching now, waiting not for details but for permission to rest. The following morning brought renewed strength and renewed clarity. When Sandra arrived, he looked more grounded than she had seen him in years. "I don't want to disappear again," he said calmly, "but I don't want to return the same way either." Sandra smiled, a mixture of pride and understanding in her expression. "Then don't," she replied. "Let this be a transition, not a return." The world would continue knocking, demanding answers, forming narratives. But for the first time, Keanu felt less afraid of that noise. He was learning that presence did not require performance, and honesty did not require exposure. Somewhere between silence and spectacle, there was a path that honored both self and others. And as he continued to heal, that path began to reveal itself, step by careful step. The day He stepped back into the light. Leaving the hospital was quieter than Keanu had imagined. There were no dramatic exits, no gathered crowd waiting to see him walk through the doors, no sense of closure wrapped neatly around the experience. Instead, there was a simple discharge conversation, a handshake from a nurse who wished him well without ceremony, and the soft slide of automatic doors opening to a world that felt both familiar and strangely new. Sandra walked beside him, matching her pace to his, aware that this moment carried more weight than any premiere or public appearance they had ever shared. Outside, the air felt different. It always did after days spent inside walls designed to protect, to slow time, to create space for recovery. The city moved at its usual speed, unaware that something meaningful had shifted within one of its quiet pedestrians. Keanu paused briefly on the sidewalk, grounding himself, noticing how his breath met the open air without resistance. This was not a return to normal. It was the beginning of something more deliberate. The drive away from the hospital was silent, but not uncomfortable. Sandra let the quiet exist without filling it, understanding that some thoughts needed space before they could be spoken. Keanu watched the city pass by, noticing details he might have once ignored, the way sunlight reflected off windows, the steady rhythm of people moving through their lives, each carrying unseen stories of their own. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel compelled to rush back into the flow. He felt allowed to observe from the edge. At his apartment, familiarity met him gently. The space was unchanged, yet he was not. He moved through the rooms slowly, noticing the signs of a life lived on momentum rather than intention. Unfinished books, reminders of projects stacked neatly but untouched, reminders of how easily rest had been postponed. Sandra stood nearby, offering presence rather than guidance, allowing him to rediscover the space on his own terms. Later that afternoon, the question he had been circling finally demanded attention. It was no longer theoretical. It was practical, immediate, and deeply personal. How would he re-enter a world that expected him to be unchanged, untouched, unaffected? His team waited patiently for direction, honoring his request for time but knowing that silence could not stretch forever without consequence. Keanu sat at his desk, the same one where he had written scripts, letters, and notes over the years. He opened the message he had drafted in the hospital, reading it again with fresh eyes. The words felt honest, but he sensed they needed grounding, something that reflected not just what he had experienced, but what he had learned. He revised carefully, removing anything that felt performative, anything that sounded like explanation rather than truth. When he was finished, the message was simple, thoughtful, and intentional. It spoke about stepping back, about listening to one's limits, about gratitude for care received, and about the importance of allowing oneself to heal without shame. Sandra read it quietly when he handed her the phone. She did not comment immediately, giving herself time to feel the weight of the words. When she looked up, her expression was calm and assured. "This doesn't ask for sympathy," she said. "It invites understanding." That distinction mattered more than either of them could fully articulate. Keanu nodded, knowing that once this message went out, it would shape the narrative whether he wanted it to or not. But for the first time, he felt aligned with that responsibility rather than burdened by it. The post went live without announcement or embellishment. No interviews followed. No follow-up explanations were offered. The words stood on their own, quiet but firm, grounded in sincerity rather than defense. And almost immediately, the world responded, not with the chaos he had feared, but with something unexpectedly human. Messages of support appeared, not loud or invasive, but thoughtful. People shared their own experiences of exhaustion, of reaching limits they didn't know they had, of learning too late that rest was not weakness. Keanu read some of them later that evening, not obsessively, but with curiosity. He saw himself reflected in stories far removed from his own life, people who worked unseen jobs, cared for families, carried responsibilities without applause. The realization humbled him. His experience was personal, but its resonance was shared. Over the following days, he resisted the urge to rush back into routine. Invitations waited. Scripts could be read later. Commitments were renegotiated with honesty rather than apology. This pause, he understood now, was not a disruption to his life, but a recalibration of it. He spent time walking, thinking, listening, allowing stillness to become something other than discomfort. Sandra remained present, not constantly, but consistently. They talked often, sometimes deeply, sometimes lightly, finding balance in conversation that didn't demand solutions. She noticed how Keanu carried himself differently now, less guarded, more aware. There was a steadiness to him that had not been there before, not because he was stronger, but because he was no longer pretending to be invulnerable. One evening, as they sat quietly, Keanu spoke a thought he had been holding. "I think I spent years believing that resilience meant never stopping," he said thoughtfully. "But maybe it means knowing when to." Sandra smiled softly, and trusting that the world doesn't fall apart when you do. That idea settled deeply within him. He realized that the fear of disappearing had been rooted not in losing relevance, but in losing identity. Who was he if he wasn't always moving forward, always showing up, always carrying more than his share? The answer he was learning was simple and profound. He was still himself, perhaps more fully than before. As the days passed, the noise softened. The world adjusted as it always did. New stories emerged, attention shifted, and life continued. But something lasting remained beneath the surface, a quiet example set not through performance but through presence. Keanu had not returned unchanged. He had returned aware. And as he prepared for what would come next, he understood that the most meaningful work ahead might not be what he created for the screen, but how he chose to live when no one was watching. The moment that tested everything. Time has a quiet way of testing what we claim to have learned. In the weeks following Keanu's return from the hospital, life did not rush back all at once, but it did not stay still either. Invitations arrived slowly at first, phrased carefully, carrying a tone of understanding rather than expectation. A charity event postponed its request. A production team offered flexibility. Friends checked in without asking for explanations. On the surface, it seemed as though the world had adjusted to his pause with grace. Yet beneath that courtesy, the familiar current of pressure waited patiently, as it always did, ready to see whether this newfound balance would hold when confronted with real decisions. The test arrived quietly, disguised as opportunity rather than demand. A project Keanu had long admired resurfaced with renewed interest, one that carried meaning beyond prestige, promising to reach people in ways that felt aligned with his values. It was the kind of work that once would have felt impossible to refuse, not because of obligation, but because of purpose. When the offer came, it stirred something within him, excitement mixed with caution, curiosity tempered by awareness. This was not just about saying yes or no. It was about whether he could engage without surrendering the boundaries he had only just begun to understand. Sandra joined him one afternoon as he sat with the proposal spread across his table, notes carefully arranged, not with urgency, but with thoughtfulness. They spoke about the opportunity in measured tones, neither romanticizing nor dismissing it. Keanu admitted that part of him still equated meaningful work with personal sacrifice, a belief so deeply ingrained it felt almost natural. Sandra listened, then reminded him gently that alignment did not require depletion, and that choosing wisely was not the same as choosing less. What unsettled Keanu most was not the workload, but the symbolism. Accepting this project would mark his first major step back into public life. Declining it might protect his healing, but risk being misunderstood. For years, he had navigated such choices by intuition alone, trusting that his endurance would carry him through. Now he found himself pausing, evaluating not just what he could do, but what he should. The days that followed were filled with reflection rather than action. Keanu spent time walking through neighborhoods where no one recognized him, observing the steady rhythm of ordinary life. He noticed how people moved through their days carrying invisible burdens, how resilience showed itself not in grand gestures, but in consistency, in kindness offered without recognition. These moments grounded him, reminding him that life was larger than any single role or project, no matter how meaningful. When he finally responded to the offer, his answer surprised even him. He said yes, but with conditions. Not demands disguised as privilege, but boundaries expressed with honesty. He requested flexibility in scheduling, space for rest, and clarity in expectations. Most importantly, he communicated why these conditions mattered, framing them not as limitations, but as commitments to sustainability and presence. To his relief, the response was not resistance, but respect. The world, it seemed, was more capable of understanding than he had once believed. This decision marked a subtle shift, not just in how Keanu approached work, but in how he saw himself within it. He no longer viewed participation as an all-or-nothing sacrifice. He allowed himself to believe that contribution and care could coexist. That belief, fragile but growing, reshaped his relationship with ambition, turning it from a driving force into a guiding one. As news of his involvement became public, reactions followed, measured and thoughtful. There was curiosity, of course, but also a noticeable absence of the frenzy he had once feared. People responded not to spectacle, but to sincerity. Messages arrived from individuals who had found courage in his pause, who felt seen by his willingness to step back and return with intention. Keanu read them quietly, recognizing the responsibility that came with influence, but also the opportunity to model something healthier than relentless endurance. One evening, after a long day of preparation that felt productive rather than draining, Keanu and Sandra sat together in comfortable silence. The city hummed outside, indifferent yet alive. Keanu reflected aloud on how close he had come to repeating old patterns, how easily he might have accepted the project without question, sacrificing well-being for perceived purpose. He acknowledged that the true test had not been the offer itself, but the choice to approach it differently. Sandra smiled, recognizing the growth in his words. "You didn't just make a decision," she said. "You changed the way you make them." That realization settled deeply within him. He understood now that healing was not a single event, nor was it preserved by isolation. It was maintained through ongoing awareness, through choices that honored both passion and limits. This moment, this test, had affirmed that he could engage with the world without losing himself in it. As he prepared for what lay ahead, Keanu felt a quiet confidence, not rooted in certainty but in trust. Trust that he could listen to himself, trust that he could adapt, trust that strength did not demand self-erasure. The journey was far from over, but the path felt clearer, illuminated not by applause, but by intention. And in that clarity, Keanu found something he had not known he was searching for all along: permission to live fully without burning out, to give generously without disappearing, and to stand in the light without abandoning the quiet that sustained him. The quiet legacy he never intended to leave. The first day back on set did not feel triumphant, and that was precisely what made it meaningful. There were no speeches, no dramatic reunions, no moment engineered for impact. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement exchanged in small gestures, respectful nods, patient pacing, and an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had changed. Keanu arrived early, not out of obligation, but out of intention, grounding himself in the space before the noise of production began. He felt present in a way he hadn't for years, not because the pressure was gone, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. As the hours unfolded, he noticed how differently he moved through the day. He listened more carefully to his body, stepping away when fatigue whispered instead of waiting for it to shout. He spoke openly with those around him, not about his experience in detail, but about rhythm, balance, and respect for limits. To his surprise, this openness did not weaken authority or focus. It strengthened trust. The environment shifted subtly, becoming more human, more collaborative, as if his willingness to honor himself had given others permission to do the same. Sandra visited later that afternoon, watching from a distance as Keanu worked with calm focus rather than relentless intensity. She saw not the absence of passion, but its refinement. Where he once pushed through exhaustion, he now paused with intention. Where he once absorbed responsibility silently, he now shared it thoughtfully. The change was not loud, but it was undeniable. This was not a man returning to who he had been. This was someone becoming who he was meant to be. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened beyond the walls of workspaces and schedules. Conversations began emerging in places Keanu never anticipated. People spoke openly about rest, about boundaries, about the courage it took to step back before breaking down. His brief message, simple and sincere, continued to ripple outward, not as a headline, but as a quiet reference point. Teachers, caregivers, artists, parents, and workers of every kind found resonance in the idea that strength did not require self-erasure. Keanu did not respond to these stories publicly. He did not need to. Their existence was enough. One evening, after a long but balanced day, Keanu sat alone in his apartment, reflecting on how easily life could have taken a different turn. He thought about the night he disappeared from the red carpet, how close he had been to ignoring his limits one more time. He realized that the hospital had not been a detour, but a threshold, a moment that forced him to choose awareness over momentum. That choice, difficult and humbling, had reshaped everything that followed. Sandra joined him later, their conversation flowing naturally, touching on past memories and future possibilities without urgency. They spoke about how rarely society made space for quiet transformation, how often growth was expected to be dramatic to be valued. Keanu shared a realization that had been forming slowly within him, one that felt both simple and profound. He understood now that legacy was not built only through achievements or recognition, but through the examples set when no one was asking for them. "I never meant for this to be a lesson," he said thoughtfully. "I just needed to stop." Sandra smiled, recognizing the truth in his words. "Sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones lived quietly," she replied. That night, Keanu slept deeply, not from exhaustion, but from peace. He no longer felt the need to outrun silence or fill it with productivity. Silence had become a place of restoration rather than avoidance. In embracing it, he had reclaimed parts of himself long overshadowed by expectation. As time passed, life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than demanding. Keanu continued his work, choosing projects with care, engaging fully without losing himself. He remained kind, generous, and thoughtful, but no longer at the cost of his own well-being. The world continued to watch, but with a softer gaze, shaped by understanding rather than entitlement. The red carpet night faded into memory, no longer defined by disappearance but by what followed. Not scandal, not mystery, but growth. A reminder that even those who seem unbreakable carry unseen weight, and that choosing to pause can be an act of courage powerful enough to change not just one life but many. In the end, Keanu did not return as a symbol of perfection or resilience without limits. He returned as something far more impactful, a human being who listened, learned, and lived with intention. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy not of spectacle, but of compassion, balance, and quiet strength that continued to inspire long after the noise had faded.